Today we're going to look at the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic refers to automatic. It's basically our involuntary nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is an involuntary arm of your peripheral nervous system, meaning that it's outside the central nervous system, also called the visceral motor division. Visceral refers to the internal organs, motor because it's an effector. It's going to produce an effect. Okay. The autonomic nervous system can then be subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and both systems are constantly working together in maintaining homeostasis. And the reason you have two different systems is because our activity varies during the day. When we go to bed at night, we're asleep, we're at rest. So the internal body systems are regulated by your parasympathetic nervous system. So it basically just keeps the status quo. Whereas during the daytime, when you're more active, you need basically more adrenaline, more hormones, more epinephrine, mainly to regulate homeostasis during these periods of activity. So it oversees all of your vital functions, including your vital signs like your heart rate, your respiratory rate, blood pressure, your digestive system, your urinary system. But it does that autonomously without your being aware of it, without conscious control. So your autonomic nervous system uses a series of reflexive actions called visceral reflex arcs. And it's sort of similar to somatic reflex arc, except that it's beneath, it basically involves your internal visceral body organs. So again, it involves a sensory stimulus that leads to predictable motor response. So if you look at an example of one, sensory signals from, let's say, an organ like the heart, the lungs, the GI tract, and the skin are sent by afferent sensory neurons. Afferent, remember, means it's leading to a structure like the spinal cord or brain. And that's where the sensory signals, the sensory stimuli are basically integrated. They're processed by the brain and spinal cord. Next, the motor impulses from the central system will be sent out via the efferent neurons. Efferent refers to leaving a structure in the cranial and spinal nerves. So in this instance, the cranial and spinal nerves will be part of our peripheral system because they're outside the brain and spinal cord. And they usually lead to a location called the autonomic ganglia in the peripheral nervous system. The sympathetic system houses its ganglia very close to the spinal cord, called the sympathetic ganglia, whereas the peripheral nervous system, their ganglia, where you see the parasympathetic motor neurons communicating with each other, those occur in ganglia very near the organs that they target, okay, like in the GI tract or near the GI tract or near the heart. It's a two-motor nerve system for both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, whereas the somatic nervous system involves a single synapse. It's just a one motor neuron. So here's a diagram that shows you your sensory signals being sent by a visceral organ like the stomach. For example, let's say your stomach starts to stretch after you eat a big meal. So then those sensory neurons then are send their stimuli to the brain. The brain processes the information, and then a appropriate motor response will be sent to the visceral organ to produce an effect. So remember your somatic motor division neurons, those innervate your voluntary skeletal muscles. Those are initiated on a conscious level, whereas your autonomic motor neurons, the autonomic motor division, those neurons innervate smooth muscle cells, glands, or basically produce involuntary activities. Okay, smooth muscle, the heart, and your endocrine glands. Those are your three organs that are targeted by the autonomic nervous system. Both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Also, your autonomic neurons do not directly innervate their target cells like the somatic neurons do. Okay, they require a neuron circuit rather than just a one neuron circuit. So what are the names of these neurons, these two motor neurons? They're the preganglionic neuron, preganglionic, that means before the ganglion. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So the initial efferent neuron, the cell body, resides within the central nervous system. And those axons release acetylcholine. Okay. And then the postganglionic neuron cell bodies, they're going to reside in the autonomic ganglia in the peripheral system. Those axons then travel to their target cells, trigger a change in either inhibitory or excitatory by either releasing the neurotransmitters acetylcholine or norepinephrine. Acetylcholine and norepinephrine can act as neurotransmitters or hormones. So this is a comparison, this figure 14.2, of your somatic nervous system in the top area of the image, where you've got your myelinated nerve with its leaving the spinal cord, okay? Of course, the cell bodies are in the spinal cord, okay? And then they're usually in the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And then they finally reach the target organ. You can see the synaptic terminals and the axon terminals innervating a skeletal muscle fiber for contraction. So remember, the somatic is basically voluntary. Whereas the parasympathetic, you have two motor neurons. So your main structural and functional differences between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems: one, your sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic axons are usually shorter, and the postganglionic axons are usually longer. Whereas your parasympathetic nervous system, the first neuron, the preganglionic parasympathetic axons, are relatively long, while the postganglionic axons are relatively short. So the anatomy is just reversed. Okay, as you can see in your sympathetic motor neurons, your first axon is relatively short, as you can see in the image in this figure, whereas your second postganglionic neuron is relatively long. The ganglion is this little yellow circle here, and that's where the axon terminals of the pre-ganglionic neuron synapses with the postganglionic cell body. Now the parasympathetic neuron, you can see in green, the cell bodies again are in different areas of the spinal cord. They're in the brainstem or the sacrospinal cord. So we sometimes call the parasympathetic nervous system the craniosacral division, okay, because they're carried by the cranial and sacral nerves. But they're going to have a very long preganglionic axons and very short postganglionic axons. So where did the sympathetic nervous system, where did the structures occur? Okay, the preganglionic cell bodies, those originate in your thoracic and upper lumbar spinal cord. And that's what gives rise to the alternate name for the sympathetic nervous system, which is the sympathetic, which is the thoracolumbar division. And then the sympathetic ganglia are generally located very near the spinal cord in what's called the sympathetic chain ganglia. And that's where the preganglionic axon synapse with the postganglionic cell bodies. And then the long postganglionic axons then will proceed to their target organ. Also, the activities of the sympathetic and parasympathetic contrast. We call the sympathetic division the fight or flight division because it prepares you for an emergency situation. It's very important for maintaining homeostasis when your body is engaged in physical work or activity. It also mediates the body's response to emotion. Whereas your parasympathetic nervous system, sometimes called the rest and digest system, those preganglionic cell bodies are located within the nuclei of several cranial nerves in your brainstem, very close to the cranial nerves that we discussed in chapter 13, and the sacral region of the spinal cord. And that's what gives rise to the alternate name for the parasympathetic division, and it's also called the craniosacral division. So your 12 cranial nerves innervate structures of your head and neck, your thoracic organs like your heart, lung, and also most of your abdominal organs, your visceral organs like your GI tract and bladder and urinary tract and reproductive organs. Whereas the sacral nerves innervate different structures within the pelvic cavity, like the urinary system and the reproductive organs. Cell bodies of your postganglionic neurons, those are very close to their target organ, so it requires only a short axon to finish the connection. And the activities are more concerned with activities related to rest and digestion. So that's how we contrast the sympathetic with the parasympathetic. So this is an overview illustrating the sympathetic division on the left, where you see these short preganglionic axons. And you can see the sympathetic chain ganglia on the left side of the spinal cord. Whereas and you have long postganglionic axons proceeding to their target organs. You do have some of the ganglia in the sympathetic nervous system or the thoracolumbar nervous system just outside the sympathetic chain ganglia that you see here. But most of them are in the sympathetic ganglia. Whereas your parasympathetic system, remember their cell bodies lie in the cranial and sacral areas of the spinal cord. So they're going to have very long preganglionic axons and very short postganglionic axons because they only have to go a very short distance to the target organ. Of course, the ganglions are those little yellow circles between the green colored axons of the parasympathetic division. So you have a delicate balance between your parasympathetic and sympathetic. Most of the activities of both systems are antagonistic to each other, okay? And that's what helps maintain this delicate balance to basically ensure that homeostasis is preserved at all times. So let's look at the sympathetic division in more detail now. Of course, I mentioned the sympathetic chain ganglia, which is basically where the fight or flight system ganglia are located. That's where the postganglionic cell bodies are located. They run down sides parallel with the vertebral column at the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. And they look like a chain, so they have this chain-like appearance, and that's how they got their name. You do have a section of the chain that extends above the thoracic spinal cord, and that then terminates in the superior cervical ganglia, and then another section of the chain that extends below the lumbar area, and that terminates in the inferior sacral ganglia. So the preganglionic neurons, the cell bodies, originate in the lateral horns of your thoraco and lumbar region of the spinal cord. And then the axons exit of the lower motor neurons through the anterior roots or ventral roots. The preganglionic axons then quickly separate from the spinal nerve, the anterior ramus, and they form a small nerve called the white rami communicantes. It's white because it's myelinated, and that leads to the postganglionic cell bodies in the sympathetic chain ganglia. So here's an illustration showing you the preganglionic neuron cell body located in the lateral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And then the axons then leave the gray matter and then go through the white matter, and they go through the ventral root, okay? And then they reach the white rami communicantes, and then they terminate in the sympathetic chain ganglia, where they meet the second axon, the second neuron. Some preganglionic axons will pass through the chain ganglia without forming synapses. They also may form synapses with collateral ganglia near the target organ. And you also have preganglionic axons that synapse with collateral ganglia near the organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity, like the GI tract. And these are components of splanchnic nerves. Splanchnic refers to the GI tract, the organs of the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, it's just kind of a side note. I've seen many questions derived from the splanchnic nerves, where what they are and where they're located. So So here's your gross and your microscopic anatomy of your sympathetic nervous system, showing you the travel of the sympathetic nervous system. As you can see, the sympathetic chain ganglia lie outside the spinal cord, the thoracic lumbar region of the spinal cord. And then the second axon, the second motor neuron, then travels on to the targets where they innervate. Okay, you do have collateral ganglia, though, that are located outside the sympathetic chain ganglia, like the celiac ganglia and the superior mesenteric ganglia that go to the different abdominal organs. So you have three synapse locations that can be possible between pre- and postganglionic neurons in your sympathetic division. One possibility, the preganglionic axons can synapse with postganglionic cell bodies in the sympathetic chain ganglia at the level of the spinal cord where they exit. Second possibility is the preganglionic axons can either go up or down the sympathetic chain ganglia, ascend or descend. Then they synapse with the postganglionic cell bodies in the sympathetic ganglia, but found at a different cord level, different spinal cord level than where they exited. In other words, they're not at the same level. And then the third possibility, the third route that the sympathetic nerves can take is they can pass through, the preganglionic axons can pass through the chain ganglia entirely and then travel to a distant collateral ganglia where they then synapse. So your postganglionic axons will then exit the ganglia as small unmyelinated rami communicantes because they're unmyelinated, and that gives them a grayish appearance. And then these will reunite to travel with the spinal nerves until they reach their target cells. And this is, like we said before, that in referred pain you have a lot of nerves that travel from the visceral organs, that travel with your somatic nerves. And that's the reason you can sometimes experience basically a gallbladder abscess in your right shoulder, or sometimes you'll experience a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, and you'll experience it up in the right arm and left shoulder and left neck and jaw area when you're having a cardiac MI. Okay, so let's look at the neurotransmitters. Now, the sympathetic neurotransmitters bind to specific protein-based receptors, and they're embedded in the plasma membranes of their target cells. So the next few slides will summarize the sympathetic neurotransmitters in the nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, and their target cell receptors with which they bind. So let's look at the sympathetic neurotransmitters. Okay. Some of these are going to be common to both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter used in excitatory synapses between your sympathetic preganglionic axons and postganglionic neurons. And then the postganglionic axons then transmit the action potentials to their target cells. So you have acetylcholine at both ends of the axons, okay, in the first synapse and in the second synapse. So when they synapse with their target cells, the postganglionic axons release one of three neurotransmitters, either acetylcholine, epinephrine, adrenaline, or norepinephrine, which is called noradrenaline. And of course, noradrenaline is the most frequently utilized neurotransmitter released into synapses between the postganglionic axons with their target cells. So acetylcholine is in your first synapse, and then you got the choice of three neurotransmitters in your second synapse, either acetylcholine, epinephrine, or norepinephrine, even though norepinephrine is the most frequently used neurotransmitter. So these neurotransmitters have to bind to a receptor, and they also have functions, and they're differentiated. Okay, and if you go into the medical field, the nursing field, and deal with drugs, medications, you'll become very familiar with these receptors because certain medications and drugs interact with these receptors, and that's how they achieve their pharmacological effects. So your adrenergic receptors from the term adrenaline. These bind to epi and norepinephrine. These are your two major types of adrenergic receptors. Okay, and alpha and beta, those are your then further classified into two subtypes. Alpha 1 receptors are in your smooth muscle cells of many of your different organs, including blood vessels in the skin, the GI tract and kidneys, as well as the erector pili muscles in the dermis, in the skin. And then you have the alpha 2 receptors in other organs like the prostate gland. Now, beta 1 receptors and beta 2 and beta 3 receptors, this is the second subtype of sympathetic receptor. Beta 1 receptors are found in your heart, okay, in your cardiac myocytes. Also, they're found in the kidney cells and fat cells, adipocytes. The second type of adrenergic, the beta 2 receptors, those are in the plasma membranes of your smooth muscle cells that line your respiratory bronchioles. So they're in your lungs. And also they're located in the walls of the urinary bladder, the skeletal muscle fibers, and the liver, pancreas, and the salivary glands. And then the third type of beta receptor, the third type of subtype, are your beta 3 receptors. And these are located in fat tissue, adipocytes, as well as digestive tract smooth muscle cells. Okay, now let's look at the cholinergic receptors. These bind to acetylcholine. As you might guess, these receptors are named for the neurotransmitter that they bind to. Okay, and that's how we get the name cholinergic. They bind to acetylcholine. You got two types of cholinergic receptors. One is the muscarinic receptors. These are found in your sweat glands in the skin. And then the second type are your nicotinic receptors. They're in the membranes of all your postganglionic neurons within the sympathetic ganglia and the adrenal medulla. Okay. Alpha 2 receptors will differ from your other adrenergic receptor subtypes. And I'll explain. Usually acetylcholine, usually the action potential, in a preganglionic neuron leads to the release of acetylcholine, and that stimulates the postganglionic neuron. When norepi binds to alpha 2 receptors, the axon terminal is hyperpolarized. It makes it more negative. And what that does, it slows or cancels the action potential. Okay, and that's how it basically suppresses the activity. So the reason you have these types of receptors, these alpha 2 receptors, they function as a component of a negative feedback loop, where the preganglionic neuron activity is reduced or shut down to prevent any excessive sympathetic input, sympathetic output, because this, of course, could possibly be dangerous for certain conditions, especially for the heart. So here's an image showing you on the left an alpha 2 receptor with no norepinephrine. So as you can see, the alpha 2 receptors embedded in the axon terminals are basically no receptors, and you can see the synaptic vesicles with their neurotransmitters. They're released. So since you don't have alpha 2 receptors bound to them, the preganglionic neuron will release acetylcholine, and that excites that postganglionic neuron. So that's an example of what happens with the alpha 2 receptors with no norepinephrine. In the figure B, you can see that when the alpha 2 receptors bind to the norepinephrine, that's what you see up there in green, the preganglionic neuron hyperpolarizes, and that will then decrease the release of acetylcholine as well as your postganglionic neuron activity. And that's how it basically inhibits excessive sympathetic output. And the different types of these sympathetic nervous system receptors, the alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3, these have provided targets for a lot of medication therapy, and also for relieving discomfort in many conditions and disease states, including asthma and hypertension. We give what we call beta blockers, alpha blockers, especially to patients with cardiac coronary artery disease, and they've had or asthma. In people that have tachycardia, fast heart rate, we give them a lot of beta blockers, and high blood pressure, hypertension, we give them beta blockers. So what is the effect on the different organs like the heart? So the effects of the sympathetic system on the target cells, remember, it's directed at ensuring survival and maintaining homeostasis during times of either physical or emotional stress. So on the heart, when the norepi binds to the beta-1 receptors, it basically causes two things to happen. One is the ion channels open up. That raises both the rate and force of contraction because the sodium channels are opened up, and now that causes a faster action potential. And it also causes the amount of blood delivered to the tissues as well as the blood pressure to both increase. And that helps preserve homeostasis during this increased activity. Smooth muscle cells. The effect of smooth muscle cells when norepi binds to specific receptors, it causes constriction of blood vessels serving the digestive, urinary, and the integumentary. And that occurs when norepi binds to alpha-1 receptors, and it decreases blood flow to those organs. If you think about it, it makes sense because you don't want blood flow, an increased blood flow going to your skin or to your digestive system during times of increased activity. You want them to go to your muscles and to your heart. It also causes dilation of blood vessels serving the skeletal and cardiac muscle. That occurs when the norepi binds to beta-2 receptors, which increases blood flow. That allows for an increase in physical activity. You need increased cardiac contraction to get increased cardiac output, and that will increase the blood flow so that you can meet these increased demands to maintain homeostasis. It also causes contraction of the urinary and digestive sphincters, and so it prevents urination and defecation, and that occurs when the norepi binds to beta-2 and beta-3 receptors. So during this increased activity, this time of increased activity during this physical stress that you're experiencing, it makes emptying the bladder and bowel much more difficult during these increased activities of physical stress. It also causes your digestive tract smooth muscle to relax. You're basically inhibiting the digestive processes. And that occurs also when the norepi binds to beta-2 receptors. So it's going to slow digestion. It dilates the pupils. That occurs when the norepi binds to the alpha-1 receptors. There's a smooth muscle in your pupils, the outer smooth muscle that dilates when adrenaline released by the sympathetic nervous system is released. And that will cause the pupil to dilate to allow more light entry, so you can see better to react to this stress. And it causes constriction of blood vessels serving most of your exocrine glands. Remember, exocrine glands are glands with ducts. So that occurs when the norepi binds to the beta receptors on the blood vessels serving the different various glands like your salivary glands, and it does decrease the secretion, except for the sweat glands, and that's the only exception. It actually does not do that in the sweat glands because sweating is the way we control our body temperature. It helps us to release heat. Okay, so it will not do that to the sweat glands. It will actually increase sweating. Okay, on cellular metabolism, during sympathetic activation, nearly all cells, especially your skeletal muscle, require higher amounts of energy, ATP, to meet these higher energy demands. And so it demands more epinephrine, and it has three effects. When it binds to the beta-3 receptors on your adipocytes, it triggers breakdown of lipids. Break down more lipids, you get more free fatty acids, which can serve as fuels for metabolism into the bloodstream, and for, you're able to feed your muscles so they can contract faster. Beta-2 receptors act on the liver, the hepatocytes, and that triggers the release of glucose from the stored glycogen in the liver, as well as synthesis of new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. Okay, and that's called gluconeogenesis. And it also binds to the beta-2 receptors on the pancreas And that triggers the release of a hormone called glucagon, which does the opposite of insulin. It increases your blood sugar. Okay, your sympathetic nervous system attempts to control body temperature and maintain homeostasis during this increased physical activity period. So your postganglionic sympathetic neurons release acetylcholine onto the sweat gland cells in the skin. Acetylcholine then binds to the muscarinic receptors that thus increase your sweat gland secretion. And this is again is that negative feedback component that corrects your elevated body temperature. Okay, so this is a summary of the main effects of the sympathetic nervous system. There's your sympathetic nervous system, your target tissues, your target organs, the neurotransmitter involved. Notice norepinephrine is in the majority of the synapses, in the presynaptic synapse. And you only have exceptions of acetylcholine on the sweat glands and the cells of the adrenal medulla. Okay, and then the type of receptor, alpha-1 receptors in the eyes and the pupils, beta-1 and beta-2 in the salivary glands, beta-1 in the heart, beta-2 in your respiratory system and the bronchial tubes. Cells of the sweat glands are muscarinic, increase in secretion. Don't forget that. That's always a test question. I just might mention that. Muscarinic is always is basically a receptor that reacts to the acetylcholine, which increases, of course, sweat, so that you can release more heat. If you remember the basic activities of your sympathetic system, it'll help you work out the finer details, like why do you sweat more? Okay, mainly to maintain body temperature, so you can release more heat. Now, the alpha-1 receptors, those are in the skin blood vessels, so those are going to constrict when they react with norepinephrine, because and then your smooth muscle cells of your blood vessels to the skeletal muscle, of course, they're going to dilate because you need more blood flow, and those are the beta-2 receptors. And then norepinephrine also binds to your digestive and urinary system, blood vessels. And those are alpha-1, so they cause vasoconstriction. You want to vasoconstrict, that reduces blood flow, because you don't really need your digestive organs, going through peristalsis and then being active, during this increased sympathetic activity. Okay, so the digestive glands, norepinephrine, beta-2 receptors, decrease in secretions. Pancreas and liver, norepinephrine again is beta-2 receptors. And then they decrease secretion also, like all the exocrine glands. And the cells of the pancreas and liver, beta-2 again, increase in release of glucose. Remember, you need glucose to act as a fuel for contraction of more muscles. Okay, and then again, your adrenal medulla, you have the exception, acetylcholine, and those are nicotinic receptors. Okay, and they release epi and norepinephrine. So you have your nicotinic receptors in the adrenal medulla, and your muscarinic receptors in the sweat glands. And the rest are either alpha or beta. Okay, now the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, also called, remember the adrenal medulla is part of your adrenal gland. It's the inner core of your adrenal gland. And so they sit on top of the kidneys in direct contact with the preganglionic sympathetic neurons. The adrenal medulla is actually nervous tissue. Okay, so the medulla is composed of modified sympathetic postganglionic neurons. So when the sympathetic system is activated, acetylcholine is released from the preganglionic neurons, which then bind to the nicotinic receptors. Acetylcholine then stimulates the medulla to release norepi and epi. They then start acting as hormones rather than as neurotransmitters, okay? And they serve as long-distance messengers. So when you look at this little flow chart, you can see the adrenal medulla in the center of the adrenal glands and the release of the neurotransmitters, okay? So the preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine. that causes the nicotinic receptor, the adrenal medulla cells binding, and then the acetylcholine then stimulates the medulla cells to release epi and norepi into the bloodstream. Okay, so they're going to serve as hormones rather than as neurotransmitters. And that gives you a more broader, more diffuse activity of your sympathetic nervous system, because you're carrying the sympathetic activity to all of the organs within the body when these hormones work, okay, rather than being confined to a neurotransmitter. So your sympathetic system influences many of your other target cells, all with the mission of keeping homeostasis intact during increased physical activity or emotional stress. It enhances mental alertness. It increases neuron activity in association areas of the cerebral cortex. It temporarily increases tension generated by skeletal muscle cells during the contraction. This is why some people have been able to achieve these unusual feats of strength with an adrenaline rush, like when a grandmother has her baby with a motorcycle tire or car tire running over her baby's arm, and she miraculously pushes the car out of the way. Okay, and that's actually happened. It also, the sympathetic system also increases the tendency for the blood to clot, and that can be also helpful, just in case a person is injured during one of these fight or flight situations. Also, the post-ganglionic sympathetic neurons trigger contraction of your erector pili muscles, which produces goosebumps, and it causes ejaculation of semen via the effects of smooth muscle cells on your male reproductive ducts. Okay, so your sympathetic nervous system mainly increases metabolic rate. That increases the rate of ATP production and consume. There is a dietary supplement manufacturer, that many of them that have created products intended to produce weight loss, and they do this by selling these topical creams that the user rubs over his problem areas with excess adipose tissue. And one chemical that is found in these creams is yohimbine, which is a plant. Manufacturers claim that yohimbine binds to the beta-3 receptors on the adipocytes, and that's how it triggers breakdown of lipids. But it's misleading because it actually blocks the alpha-1 receptors in the blood vessels and the alpha-2 receptors in the spinal cord. So it actually causes vasodilation and also increasing sympathetic neuron activity, which can then increase metabolic rate. And that can dangerously elevate the heart rate to dangerous levels. It can cause seizures, high blood pressure, kidney failure, insomnia, panic attacks. The good thing about it is it's not absorbed very well through the epidermis and very significantly, so it really never reaches beyond the blood vessels in the dermis and the hypodermis. So that's how it limits really any amount of harm it can do to your body. But it's not effective either, because if it doesn't get into your body, the whole of your body, it's not going to have its advertised physiological effect. So that's the sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight or thoracolumbar system. Now let's look at the parasympathetic division, our rest and digest division. So it has a role in maintaining the body's functions like digestion and urine formation. It's also called the craniosacral division because of the association with the cranial and pelvic nerves from the sacral plexus. So here's your parasympathetic nervous system here in green. You can see the long preganglionic neurons with the postganglionic neurons with very short axons very near their target cells. Notice the cranial nerve is a facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, oculomotor, and the vagus nerve, 3, 7, 9, and 10. These all have parasympathetic contributions. Okay, and then you can see on the lower part of the image, you can see the the pelvic nerves leading to their abdominal and pelvic areas. Okay, so that's why we call it the cranial sacral division, because it's located in the cranial and sacral regions of the spinal cord and brain. So your parasympathetic cranial nerves associated with the oculomotor, number 3, facial, number 7, glossopharyngeal, 9, and vagus, 10. That we learned in chapter 13. The vagus is your main parasympathetic nerve. Okay, it innervates most of your abdominal organs, like your GI tract, your pancreas, your liver, gallbladder, and most of your thoracic organs, your heart, respiratory system. Also, branches of the vagus will contribute to the cardiac, pulmonary, and esophageal plexuses. So the preganglionic axons in the oculomotor nerve, those synapse with the ciliary ganglia, very close to the eye. The submandibular and pterygopalatine ganglia house cell bodies of sensory neurons and synapse with your facial nerve. They're also going to be involved in certain secretions of it that are involved with, and then the glossopharyngeal nerve synapse with the ganglia called the otic or otic ganglia. Okay. And it's going to be associated with a lot of salivary gland activity. Okay. So your parasympathetic sacral nerves that make up the pelvic component of the division innervates the last segment of the large intestine, the urinary bladder, and your reproductive organs, the testes and ovaries. The sacral nerve branches form the pelvic splenic nerves, and they form a plexus in the pelvic floor. The preganglionic axons then will then proceed on to their targets. So both your pre- and postganglionic parasympathetic neurons then release acetylcholine at their synapses, which is basically excitatory. So you got 2 cholinergic receptors. The nicotinic receptors are in membranes of all postganglionic neurons. These were the original receptors discovered. Muscarinic receptors, they're located in membranes of all parasympathetic target cells. So, nicotinic at the postganglionic neurons and muscarinic at the parasympathetic target cells. So parasympathetic activity will decrease heart rate and blood pressure. The preganglionic parasympathetic neurons then travel to the heart with the vagus nerve. Okay, it also has effects on constriction of pupil, which involves cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor, the ciliary ganglion, and the sphincter pupillae muscle within the iris of the eye, and that reduces the amount of light that's allowed into the eye. It also allows for accommodation of the lens for near vision, and that also involves cranial number 3 and contraction of a small little muscle called the ciliary muscle, and that basically changes the lens to a more rounded shape when you're viewing near objects. So accommodation and constriction of the pupil. Oculomotor nerve number 3. That's the parasympathetic. It also constricts the bronchioles in the respiratory system. That involves number 10, the vagus nerve, which reduces airflow through the bronchioles. Just the opposite of adrenaline or epinephrine and norepinephrine. It also contracts smooth muscle in your digestive system. Also involving the vagus nerve, number 10. So it entices peristalsis, helps propel food through the digestive tract. It also relaxes your digestive and urinary sphincters. And that involves number 10, the vagus and your sacral nerves. So it promotes defecation and micturition. Micturition is urination. On the reproductive organs, it causes engorgement of the penis or clitoris, or referred to as erection. And that occurs when it stimulates the sacral nerves in both males and females. Even though the parasympathetic division only innervates specific blood vessels, many of your blood vessels will dilate when the parasympathetic system is activated, mainly due to the reduction in sympathetic activity. It overrides the sympathetic activity. And then you have glandular epithelial cells. The parasympathetic division has very little effect on sweat glands, but it does increase secretion from your other exocrine glands. Number 7, crown nerve number 7, the facial, stimulates tear production from the lacrimal glands. Lacrimal gland is the gland, of course, on the lateral surface of your sclera on your eye, as well as mucus production from the glands in the nasal mucosa. So it accelerates the production of tears. The facial and glossopharyngeal 7 and 9 also stimulation leads to increased saliva production from the salivary glands. And number 10 stimulates secretion of enzymes and other digestive tract organs because it's necessary for digestion. Parasympathetic division has no direct physiological effect that mediates your metabolic rate or mental alertness or force generated by skeletal muscle contractions, blood clotting, adipocytes, or most endocrine secretions. So each of these above bodily functions returns the body to a resting state during periods of parasympathetic activity. It also allows for replenishment of glucose storage and other fuels. And this is usually the time when you go to bed at night, when you're sleeping. This is kind of a restorative time. It also allows for replenishment of your fuels, like your glucose and nutrients, and that allows for sympathetic nervous system to function properly when it's needed. Okay, so here's an illustration showing the main physiological effects of the parasympathetic nervous system. You can see the long preganglionic axons and the very short postganglionic axons. The eyes, the lacrimal glands, salivary glands, heart. Of course, it's going to lower the heart rate via the release of acetylcholine via the vagus nerve. Causes bronchoconstriction of the bronchioles, also through the vagus nerve effects on the digestive system. It promotes digestion, so it's going to increase peristalsis, as well as the sphincters will be relaxed, so it promotes defecation and urination. And then the cells of your digestive glands, it's going to promote digestion, so it increases the secretions of many of the exocrine glands, like the pancreas and the gallbladder. Okay, smooth muscle cells are the urinary sphincters. It relaxes the sphincters, so it promotes urination as well as defecation. So you have many drugs used that can block either acetylcholine release or they can block the receptors, the acetylcholine receptors. That sometimes is an unintended physiological side effect of many medications, especially your drugs that are used in psychiatry, like your antidepressants, like Elavil. Also for many conditions like allergies, respiratory conditions like asthma, COPD, GI conditions like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Some of the more common unwanted side effects are urinary retention. This is a real common effect. It blocks the relaxing effect that the parasympathetic system has on the urinary sphincters, and that makes passing urine more difficult. It's especially true when people that have cancer or terminal illness, and they're placed on these powerful narcotics like the opiates. Constipation, since it does block the parasympathetic nervous system, it affects on the smooth muscle of the digestive tract. It causes, therefore, digested food to move more slowly through the digestive tract, and that can lead to constipation. It also causes dry mouth. That's one of the most common side effects caused by a decrease in parasympathetic nervous system's ability to stimulate secretion of saliva. So your sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions both work in synchrony to keep your body's functions within their normal homeostatic ranges. Both divisions will innervate many of the same target organs, but their actions are antagonistic with each other. And that condition is referred to as dual innervation. Dual innervation. It allows the sympathetic division to become dominant and trigger the effects that maintain homeostasis during these physically demanding periods. Even though the parasympathetic division regulates the same organs, that preserves homeostasis between these increased physical activity periods. So here's your sympathetic system compared to your parasympathetic system in figure 1411. Autonomic tone. This refers to the fact that neither division is ever completely shut down. You have constant basal activity for each division, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic tone. This is what dominates in blood vessels. It's what keeps them at all times partially constricted. Parasympathetic tone will dominate in the heart, which keeps the heart rate at an average of 72 beats per minute. There's always a condition, there's always a question on your exams that asks which autonomic nervous system dominates in the heart. Is it sympathetic or parasympathetic? And maintains a heart at an average beat of 72 beats per minute. And your answer will be parasympathetic. Parasympathetic tone basically dominates in the heart, which helps to keep that a normal heart rate of 72 beats per minute. So let's look at how the autonomic nervous system keeps its homeostasis intact. Okay, so what are the organs involved? So the homeostasis is controlled centrally by the hypothalamus and the brainstem reticular formation. Those are your two organ systems. Okay, these actions are carried out by these two divisions of the autonomic system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Autonomic centers, these regions found in the reticular formation, these will contact and relay to the hypothalamus. And they basically contain neurons that control the activity of all preganglionic sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. They're called the autonomic centers. So, in summary, you can see the cerebral cortex, of course, is going to have ultimate control. Amygdala, of course, remember the amygdala is in your limbic system. It can also have some control on the hypothalamus. Okay, so the cerebral cortex and amygdala activate the hypothalamus and reticular formation in the brainstem, and in turn, the autonomic centers regulate the sympathetic and parasympathetic output, and the hypothalamus regulates body temperature, many of your feeding behaviors, fluid intake. Your sympathetic parasympathetic neurons regulate your organs like heart rate, blood pressure, organ blood flow, digestion, urine production, and metabolic rate. And then your other nuclei in the reticular formation regulate the respiratory rhythm, sleep-wake cycle, and your acid-base balance. Okay. Of course, this is also regulated by the hypothalamus. Here's a condition referred to as postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS. What happens is it's characterized by extremely large increases in heart rate, which is called tachycardia. And this occurs when an individual moves from the lying or sitting down position to standing up. So you get an inappropriate increase in heart rate accompanied by vasodilation of most of your blood vessels, the systemic vasodilation. And then in turn causes your blood pressure to drastically drop due to gravity as you stand up. So the symptoms that result from this low blood pressure include dizziness, lightheadedness, fatigue, thirst, sometimes fainting. This low blood pressure thus reduces the blood flow to the organs. That also can lead to shortness of breath, chest pain, cold extremities, and muscle weakness. Okay. We don't know all the fundamental causes for POTS, but the symptoms are thought to be secondary to the excessive sympathetic activity or the increased sensitivity of the sympathetic receptors to the epi and norepinephrine. Normally, when a person decides to stand up, the sympathetic nervous system temporarily increases his blood pressure to ensure that he receives adequate blood flow to remain constant against the force of gravity. And then the sympathetic response then tapers off, and then your parasympathetic tone resumes control of the heart rate. Okay? But in POTS, the response to the sympathetic stimulation is extremely exaggerated. And that's what leads to those characteristic symptoms, like the low blood pressure. The treatment for POTS stems from dietary modifications, like increasing your water and salt intake. That increases fluid volume, and that therefore increases cardiac output. An exercise regimen, and medications to block the excess, sympathetic receptor sensitivity. Most patients sometimes see improvement in the condition gradually, though most will struggle with it for the remainder of their lives.